We're ready to start. Thank you so much, everyone, for being here this afternoon. And welcome to this side event on documenting reproductive violence, where we will look at challenges and opportunities for the UN investigative mechanisms. My name is Elena Rodriguez-Rontu. I work for UN Women as a policy specialist on rule of law and transitional justice, but it is an absolute privilege for me to moderate this discussion today with this amazing panel. I'd like to just quickly outline what is prepared for you today. So we're going to start with high-level opening remarks from UN Women and OHCHR. And then we will hear from Global Justice Center, where they will present their research on the opportunities and barriers faced by the investigative mechanisms. And then we will look more at the practical side of things. We will hear from a few investigators and gender advisors that will share the examples of reproductive violence they've encountered in their work. Lastly, we will hear from a national prosecutor to really bring us back to national efforts. And finally, we are also delighted to have the ambassador of Denmark who will offer us some closing remarks. So I will introduce all the speakers properly, obviously, before they speak. I just wanted to offer a quick glimpse of what we have ready. I also want to flag that we are launching today a joint publication by UN Women and Global Justice Center. I hope everyone could take a flyer on their way in. There is a QR code where you can scan and access the publication that we are delighted to launch today. Before we start, I want to thank the Permanent Mission of Denmark and Global Justice Center for organizing this event jointly with us, as well as our co-sponsors, the Permanent Missions of Canada, Colombia, and the United Kingdom, as well as Justice Rapid Response and the Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights. So without further ado, I'm pleased to hand over the floor for the high-level opening remarks. And we will first hear from UN Women's Deputy Director, Executive Director for Resource Management, Sustainability and Partnership, Mrs. Kirsi Madi. And we're very fortunate to have her in town this week. So Mrs. Madi, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Helena, and really wonderful to be here with you. And this is like coming back home. I left Geneva about 5 years ago, so it feels very familiar, except for all the renovation that's going on. But really, it's an honor to welcome you to this side event, documenting reproductive violence in Human Rights Council mandated investigations. And as Helena was saying, we are very proudly today launching the joint publication with our partner, the Global Justice Center. This publication offers critical legal analysis that will equip investigative teams to accurately label and report on instances of reproductive violence as violations of human rights and at times as international crimes. Denials of reproductive autonomy can cause uniquely profound harm, from permanently preventing a person from having children to forcing involuntary lifelong kin relationships. Capturing these nuances could inform subsequent redress and reparation efforts. Earlier today, this morning, I had the privilege of speaking at the Human Rights Council's annual discussion on the integration of gender perspective throughout the work of the Human Rights Council and that of its mechanisms. I was deeply impressed by the work carried out by the mandated investigative bodies, and I'm so happy to see some of the panelists here in this room as well today. Despite challenging environments where accountability may seem distant, their efforts to collect evidence today lay the foundation for future justice. And it is crucial that they remain forward-looking. Calls for recognizing reproductive violence as a distinct violation under international law continue to gain momentum. UN Women, in partnership with OHCHR and Justice Rapid Response, has deployed around 80 gender experts to human rights investigations and accountability bodies globally since 2009. We are extremely proud of this collaboration, as it has ensured that gender-specific harms are now documented in the vast majority of the Human Rights Council's investigative reports. These efforts have laid a strong foundation, enabling us now to tackle emerging issues such as reproductive violence. UN Women remains committed to advancing knowledge and guidance on reproductive violence and looks forward to driving these critical conversations forward. The expertise of our panel here today will surely bring us closer to a future where reproductive violence is fully recognized, persecuted, and ultimately prevented. Thank you very much for being here today, and I'm really looking forward to a fruitful and really important conversation. Thank you. Back to you.
Thank you, Ms. Madi. And I'm pleased to now hand over the floor to Mr. Alexander El-Jundi, who's the Chief of the Investigation Support Section at the Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights. Alex, over to you.
Thanks very much, Helena. Excellencies, friends and colleagues, it is truly an honor to join this discussion on the challenges and opportunities for UN investigative mechanisms in documenting reproductive violence. UN investigative mechanisms play a crucial role in uncovering violations of international human rights law, humanitarian law, and international criminal law. OHCHR currently supports 12 Human Rights Council mandated investigations on some of the most serious human rights emergencies in the world. All of these have at least one SGBV investigator and/or gender advisor, many deployed by a joint partnership of OHCHR, UN Women, and JRR. These experts are now very much part of any investigation and contribute significantly to the development of the investigation strategy, as well as to the compilation of information contained within public reports. In addition to Human Rights Council mandated investigations, OHCHR is also currently strengthening its own support capacity towards ensuring that gender-based violence is included in all investigations launched by the High Commissioner under his global mandate. An example of this is that a fact-finding team is currently deployed by the High Commissioner to Bangladesh upon the request of the interim government, and has, within a very small team of investigators, an SGBV and gender expert deployed in partnership with UN Women and JRR. This systematic inclusion of such expertise in all investigations supported by the Office represents the importance that OHCHR places in mainstreaming the inclusion of gendered considerations and SGBV documentation across all human rights investigations, along with the recognition of the distinct differential impact that some violations, abuses and crimes have on men, women, boys and girls. Through the deployment of gender advisors and gender-based violence investigators, we have seen a significant advancement in integrating a gender perspective across a broad spectrum of human rights violations and abuses investigated by Human Rights Council mandated investigations and OHCHR investigations, in addition to gender-based violence. We do, however, recognize the need to further explore the specific issue of reproductive violence as an autonomous form of GBV, as well as the need to focus evidence collection in a way that it can contribute to future accountability processes. While mandates have increasingly been designed with a considered gender perspective, recent research has shown that insufficient attention is still given to violations of sexual and reproductive health and rights. I therefore look forward to hearing more on this topic from our esteemed panelists. From our side, OHCHR is committed to enhance the attention of investigative bodies to sexual and reproductive rights and the promotion of accountability in this crucial area. Thanks very much.
Thank you very much. And we will now, I would like to give the floor to Tess Graham, who is a legal advisor at Global Justice Center. And Tess is going to introduce us to the publication that we are launching today. So Tess, we know that the Global Justice Center has been researching the extent to which reproductive violence has been documented by investigative bodies. Could you please tell us what are we talking about when we talk about reproductive violence? And which factors have you identified that either facilitate or hinder the documentation of those violations? Thank you.
Elena. Indeed, I think we should take a step back and first discuss and make sure we're all on the same page on what reproductive violence is and why its specific documentation in these investigations matters. So reproductive violence is defined as harmful acts or omissions that interfere with reproductive autonomy, or violence that is directed at people because of their reproductive capacity. Examples include forced sterilization, forced pregnancy, torture with reproductive consequences, interference with breastfeeding or lactation, and many other forms. My co-panelists will discuss other examples. Before we discuss the barriers and facilitating factors that we identified, I also want to address why this specific form of documentation is so important. The first reason was alluded to by Ms. Madi. The impact on victims of this form of violence is profound and lifelong, including those lifelong kinship relationships that may be involuntary or the foreclosure of reproductive opportunities. Recognizing those harms is necessary to mitigate the impacts. This is also an issue of gender equality. Reproductive violence has disparate impacts and is disproportionately targeted at women, meaning neglect of the issue disproportionately ignores the experiences of women and girls. Simultaneously, reproductive violence targeting men, boys, and people of diverse sexual orientation and gender identity have also been systematically overlooked, perpetuating gender stereotypes and ignoring suffering. Third, this form of documentation is important for shaping humanitarian responses, including determining the types of aid that are delivered. We know that without the documentation of reproductive violence, reproductive health resources are consistently under-delivered in crisis contexts. Finally, the documentation is necessary for mechanisms to fulfill their very mandates, which oblige them to establish an accurate historical record on which the international community can base collective action. Yet so far, reproductive violence has not been specifically documented by most UN investigative mechanisms, with notable exceptions, as you can see in our report. So we set out to understand why these gaps exist. We conducted semi-structured interviews with gender advisors and civil society experts to assess mechanisms' ability to capture reproductive violence and why they were blocked from doing so or struggled to do so in the past. We characterized these as either facilitating factors or barriers, and time is short, so I will refer you to the full report and its annex, which is available on the flyer with the QR code for full details. So these facilitating factors include structural elements, such as the terms of reference and mandate of specific mechanisms, consistent long-term deployment of gender advisors in partnership with OHCHR, JRR, UN Women, and the integration of gender expertise and support from the rest of the team and experts. Second, we identified a facilitating factor relating to law and language, including new legal precedents such as the Ongwen decision from the ICC, the Office of the Prosecutor's gender-based crimes policy, and even the term reproductive violence itself, which was found to be helpful to crystallize these harms. Finally, the active involvement of civil society and the broader local community facilitates documentation, particularly through relationships with service providers. We also identified 4 barriers to this form of documentation. First, the structure and resources of mechanisms can become a barrier when they don't meet the supportive conditions outlined before. Specifically, teams with relatively limited, dispersed gender expertise throughout the rest of the team, as well as mandates that lack explicit reference to gender analysis and instead may nod to sexual violence or SGBV only and not looking at larger forms of gender analysis. These conditions led to more difficulty documenting reproductive violence. The stigmatization of reproductive autonomy, including within mechanisms themselves, can also make the perceived sensitivity of reproductive violence into a self-fulfilling prophecy. Our interviewees described encountering resistance to documentation of reproductive topics because such topics were deemed to reflect cultural differences that are seen as uniquely insulated from analysis, discussion, or critique. This can lead to self-censorship within the reports of the mandates, and we'll note that this deference is out of sync with international law. A third category of barriers are the perceived and actual limits in law, including a relative lack of jurisprudence on the topic, the challenges of balancing ICL versus IHRL or other bodies of law, documentation for those forms of law, and relatively short time horizons faced by these mechanisms. Finally, interviewees identified analytical challenges such as integrating specialized bodies of law, including law of occupation or laws governing detention context, and the difficulty of recognizing gender discrimination that predates and underpins discrete violations as a part of the violations that are targeted by the human rights the mechanisms in their mandates. So to provide some of the legal guidance that was identified as missing within all of these barriers, we include in the paper an analysis of a dozen forms of reproductive violence under ICL, IHL, and IHRL in order to guide future documentation. This includes forced pregnancy, enforced sterilization, preventing births, and as well as other less widely recognized but equally serious forms of reproductive violence. So I'll stop now to hear from the other panelists. Thank you so much. I hope you do check out the paper with the full richness of these conversations.
Thank you so much, Tess, and I echo the invitation to go and check out the publication, because it really goes into many details about what can facilitate or what can hinder this documentation. I would now like to move to the next segment of the panel, which is the more practice-oriented section, where we are going to hear from 3 colleagues working on investigations to hear the concrete examples of reproductive violence they've encountered through their work, so that we can fully additionally understand what we mean by this concept. So the question would be the same for the 3 of them. It would be to please share examples of reproductive violence that you've encountered in your investigations, and what are the specific features of this type of violence that made you classify them as reproductive violence, and why was that classification important? So with that question, I first would like to introduce the chairperson of the fact-finding mission on Venezuela, Mrs. Marta Valiñas, who's going to join us online, hopefully.
Thank you so much, Elena. It's a pleasure to be here with you today and to share with you the experience of our fact-finding mission. As part of its mandate to investigate, among other violations, arbitrary detentions and torture and other cruel, inhuman, and degrading treatment, including those involving sexual and gender-based violence, the fact-finding mission on Venezuela has investigated and documented several acts and forms of treatment, particularly in the context of detention, that amount to reproductive violence. In connection with the most recent upsurge of violent state repression of mass protests following the presidential elections of July of this year, the mission has, for example, documented the case of a teenage girl who was arbitrarily detained, and despite having mentioned that she was pregnant, she was forced to jump and run while she was being insulted, mocked at, and threatened that she should have an abortion. Other recent cases that occurred in this same context include the case of a woman who was 10 months pregnant, held in a very small cell together with several other men and women, without access to adequate food or medical health, and the case of a woman who was breastfeeding a few months old baby, whom she was not allowed to continue breastfeeding once she was detained. National law in Venezuela provides that a woman cannot be held in pretrial detention during the 3 last months of pregnancy, or when they are breastfeeding up to 6 months after the baby's birth. Nevertheless, in the cases that I just mentioned and others documented in our reports, these provisions were not respected. We have also investigated other more brutal cases. For example, that of Emirléndez Benítez, who was detained in 2018 by the Military Counterintelligence Directorate, accused by the authorities of having been involved in a conspiracy to kill President Maduro. Among other acts, she was severely beaten, including in her abdominal area, which resulted in her having a miscarriage about a month later. The mission has documented several cases of men, both civilian and military, who have been arbitrarily detained for being perceived by the authorities to be critics of the government or having allegedly participated in what the authorities describe as conspiracies to overthrow the government, and who have been tortured in detention. As part of that torture, they were severely beaten or have received electric shocks in their genitals. These specific methods of torture can and have indeed severely impaired their reproductive capacity, as we have noted in our reports. One of those various cases, and a more recent one, is that of John Alvarez, a young student and political activist who was detained in August 2023 and was beaten and given electric shocks to his genitals and other parts of his body to force him to implicate other persons in illegal acts. Our reports have documented how the conditions of detention that sometimes may amount to forms of ill treatment in themselves impact on reproductive health and access to reproductive care, particularly for women, but also for transgender persons. We noted how women were particularly affected with the lack of access to menstrual hygiene products, but also to contraceptives, while being in some cases subject to forced sexual relations with the guards. We documented the case of a woman who, because of her detention, had to interrupt the fertility treatment she was undergoing. Due to her age and the sentence of 30 years in prison, to which she was convicted, her chances of becoming a mother have been severely compromised, which affects not only her reproductive rights, but also, of course, her mental health. Moreover, the additional obstacles placed on conjugal visits for women detainees in particular have a negative and discriminatory impact on their reproductive rights as well. Reproductive rights defenders have been targeted by state authorities in Venezuela. The mission documented the case of Venus Fadul, a lawyer and women's rights defender, who was forced into exile with 2 of her colleagues since her NGO took up the case of Vanessa Rosales, another women's rights advocate, who had been detained and indicted for giving information about voluntary interruption of pregnancy to a 13-year-old girl with a high-risk pregnancy resulting from rape, and to her mother. In Venezuela, abortion is prohibited unless in specific cases foreseen in the law involving danger to the life of the woman, and these are interpreted in a highly restrictive manner. Venus and her colleagues were threatened, surveilled, and put on a list of the Civilian Intelligence Service of people who were being investigated. Our investigation and analysis of these and other similar cases has been made possible thanks to having in our team professionals with specific gender expertise and to having a specific reference to sexual and gender-based violence in our mandate. But even before this reference was added to our mandate, we benefited from JRR and UN Women's assistance through the deployment of a gender expert, which was fundamental to the investigation of sexual and gender-based forms of torture and other ill treatment, and conducting a gender analysis of all human rights violations listed in our mandate. My conclusion, therefore, is dedicated gender expertise within a team is key. And at the same time, training to increase gender awareness of all members of the team is also of utmost importance. Thank you so much.
Valiñas. And now I would like to introduce Mrs. Laura Haigh, who's currently the gender advisor to the Special Rapporteur on Afghanistan and has previously served as an SGBV investigator and as an investigation team leader in the International Commission of Human Rights Experts on Ethiopia. Over to you, Laura, to share some of the examples you've encountered in your work.
Thank you, Helena. So I'm going to be taking off my Afghanistan hat and talking about my work with the International Commission of Human Rights Experts on Ethiopia and the work that we did looking at, crimes against humanity, war crimes and violations of refugee law, but also reproductive violence committed by Ethiopian and Eritrean forces and their allies, specifically in the Tigray region, although of course the conflict spanned beyond that region. Now, compared to other investigative bodies, the Ethiopia Commission had a relatively short period of time to conduct our investigations, less than 2 years before the mandate was discontinued. So as a consequence, we weren't able to investigate and analyse the full spectrum of violations and crimes that were committed during the conflict, including acts and patterns of reproductive violence, their impacts and consequences. So I think one of my first reflections is the importance of ensuring sufficient time for investigation, especially if we're to do so in a truly victim and survivor-centred way. Even with limited time, it's clear that multiple forms of reproductive violence were perpetrated in Tigray during the conflict, and I'll outline a couple of them here. The first was targeting on the basis of perceived reproductive capacity. Ethiopian and Eritrean forces and their allies especially targeted Tigrayan women in this way, subjecting them to rapes, sexual violence, torture, ill treatment, detention, and other forms of violence designed to dehumanize, hurt, and humiliate them. These crimes were often accompanied by threats to destroy their reproductive capacities. For example, a woman detained and then forcibly expelled from Western Tigray recalled her rapist telling her, "I'm going to destroy your uterus so you can never give birth to a Tigrayan. Tigrayan children grow like a cancer inside. Then one day they become adults." We also documented deliberate attacks on pregnant women, including rapes, beatings, and other forms of sexual and reproductive violence. This included women who were visibly pregnant, as well as women whose family members told the perpetrators they were pregnant in an attempt to protect them. Rapes and torture of Tigrayan women were often accompanied by reproductive violence involving the insertion of foreign objects, including nails, shrapnel, weapons, hot metal rods, and rocks into their bodies with the apparent aim of making them infertile. In one case, perpetrators believed to be Eritrean soldiers inserted a plastic bag, pins, and a nail cutter into a survivor's genital organs after raping her. The doctor who removed these items found a political message written on a piece of paper, which stated the intent to prevent Tigrayan women from reproducing. We also found instances of denial of reproductive autonomy over lactation and breastfeeding. For example, an ethnic Irob woman who was enslaved along with her 1-year-old daughter was prohibited from breastfeeding. The child died after just a few days. A Tigrayan woman whose nipples were burned by a naked flame during torture was so severely injured that she was unable to breastfeed her children after that. Now, atrocity crimes into the Tigray region were carried out in the context of a siege, during which Ethiopian forces and their allies used starvation as a method of warfare, deliberately interrupting food and medical supplies, severely restricting the import of fuel and cutting off essential services. They engaged in widespread looting and destruction of property, including medical facilities and equipment, and the situation was further exacerbated by severe government-imposed restrictions on humanitarian access, which I should add created significant documentation challenges, as many agencies were fearful that sharing information would jeopardize their access or lead to reprisals. The siege had devastating impacts on access to and provision of reproductive and sexual health services, especially but not only for survivors of sexual violence. Many survivors described having to wait months for the most basic medical care, and we recorded multiple instances of unwanted pregnancies and often no access to abortion services or post-exposure prophylaxis. Doctors described treating long-lasting reproductive consequences resulting from delayed access to medical care, including fistula and uterine prolapse, as well as seeing a worrying increase in maternal deaths, low birth weight deliveries, and breastfeeding women who were extremely malnourished. In our final report, the Commission observed a nexus between crimes of starvation and sexual violence and recommended further investigation. Given that starvation also has specific, disproportionate and severe consequences on reproductive rights, investigative bodies examining the use of starvation as a method of warfare should specifically investigate the links to sexual and reproductive violence, including whether these are indicia of other international crimes. Finally, it's important to highlight that reproductive violence, in particular resulting from the destruction of the health system, continued in Tigray even after the signing of a ceasefire agreement. Investigating reproductive violence after active conflict has ended is essential, not only because it represents an ongoing violation, but also because it can help capture the long-term or slow-to-manifest consequences of sexual, reproductive, and other violence, and to shape how humanitarians and other actors both categorize the situation post-conflict and design their responses and interventions. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Laura, for sharing this otherwise horrifying testimonies. Yeah, thank you. I would now like to move on to give the floor to Shubai Busuman, who's a long-serving SGBV investigator and gender and transitional justice advisor at the Commission on Human Rights in South Sudan. And Shubai is going to join us online. Over to you, Shubai.
Thank you so much, Helena, and good afternoon to you all, excellencies, distinguished guests. I hope you can hear me well, and I'm afraid I may not give a very much better picture than what Laura has just provided. Allow me to start off by just giving a little bit of context where South Sudan is concerned. 2 years ago, exactly 2 years ago, in September 2022, the Commission on Human Rights in South Sudan reported that their investigations were leading them to speak to women mostly who had been gang raped up to 5 times in the last 9 years. It's important to note that what we now term as reproductive violence is woven throughout this period. At the same time, Commissioner Bani Afako was quoted as saying, it's not that there is a lot of sexual violence in South Sudan, it's that for half of the population, women and girls, sexual violence is how they primarily experience the conflict. And it's not that sexual violence ebbs and flows, it's going on all the time, largely unseen. So South Sudan conflict has been continuing for over 10 years with very little by way of justice or accountability for survivors and victim communities. To put this in perspective, this September, October, and November, children born of rapes and gang rapes at the onset of the conflict in December, January, February 2013 and 14 will be turning 10 years old or 11 years old. So while not a case of reproductive violence per se, this falls directly in the realm of reproductive justice within the broader spectrum of issues that require redress and repair for survivors of sexual and other gendered violence. It's also important to note that while the Commission has documented reproductive violence in the ongoing conflict in South Sudan throughout its various mandates, these violations have not necessarily been identified or classified as a distinct violation, but have been identified as a key feature of sexual and other gendered violence in South Sudan. So some examples in the course of the documentation work in South Sudan of reproductive violence include rape, gang rape, including pregnant women. And of course, where women, many women that the Commission have spoken to, reporting miscarrying, loss of pregnancy, and other complications as a result of these violations, and in many instances, complications that they are unable to seek medical support for. We've also documented damage and physical harms to women's private parts, including genitalia, reproductive organs, and as my colleague Laura has just shared, including the insertion of objects into women's bodies, but also the beating, electrocution, tying, and various mutilation of men's genitalia. And in particular instances documented where men have shared that as they're held in captivity, they are tortured, and specific torture directly to their sexual and reproductive organs. Another feature or another example is women and girls in situations of sexual servitude, in some instances amounting to sexual slavery, but usually preceded by abduction, and most often in these situations where the women and girls have been taken for the sole purpose of being used as wives, as in the words of victims and survivors. Another example is the rape of lactating mothers, where women have described their inability for various cultural, socio-cultural reasons, their inability to go on breastfeeding their children following the violation. In one instance, a woman who described how she was unable to breastfeed her child after a gang rape because of the idea that any kind of contact in that way with her breastfeeding child would lead to contamination and therefore death. So a range of complications around what is required in order for a woman who has had sexual relations with a man, but in this case rape, being able to go back to providing life-sustaining, to the child, life sustenance to the child. Some specific features which led us to identify some of these crimes would be that women of childbearing age by far were the most targeted or have been the most targeted. And this is evident from various things that witnesses and victims would say, such as, we hid the young girls because we knew they would be a target. When the attackers came, they found only old people and children because the women and girls had been hidden away. Or we thought that the old people would be safe. Where men and boys have experienced sexual and gender-based violence has primarily been in context of confinement or imprisonment, and again, where genitalia and their capacity to reproduce has been targeted. And on two particular occasions, interviewing male survivors where both lamented either their inability to have normal sexual relations, or where returning to their wives or their family has not resulted in a pregnancy. The other feature, I think, is women self-opting to not seek for reproductive health care, especially in IDP settlements, because of the stigma relating to this. But also, at the same time, where reproductive health care has actually developed specifically to respond to the damage done by sexual and reproductive violence. For example, in Uganda, in many district hospitals servicing refugees coming especially from South Sudan and other countries, have built up this kind of capacity to respond. And finally, I think the specific ways in which reproductive violence contributes to the rupturing of social fabric, and the broader way in which the possibility of attacking the reproductive capacity of a community, not just an individual, and this is through both the victims who are attacked, but also the power it gives perpetrators to alter fundamentally the way in which society sees itself, its advancement, and its development. Thank you so much.
And Marta, for all these examples, as we can see, reproductive violence occurs across the globe and in very different contexts. We've heard situations of detention, sieges, armed conflicts, and we could go on, and unfortunately share still many more. But we are really interested in the links between the international investigations and national justice efforts. As we know, one of the main goals of these investigations is to gather and preserve evidence that can be used in the future in legal processes, including at the national level. And that's why I'm very pleased to introduce now to our next speaker, who's also going to join us online, Mrs. Anna Sosonska. She serves as a prosecutor and head of the Conflict-Related Sexual Violence Division in Ukraine's Office of the Prosecutor General. Anna, could you tell us a bit more about the work that Ukrainian prosecutors have done to charge reproductive violence? What types of evidence can be gathered to prove these cases, and what are the challenges you've been facing to obtain them? Over to you, Anna.
Thank you, dear colleagues, dear attendees. Also, I want to thank you for coming together today and to discuss this difficult topic. And I have to stress that during the 10 years that Russia has been at war against Ukraine. Russian armed forces have wielded sexual violence and threat of sexual violence as a tool of war and a tool of occupation. And of course, if we are talking about sexual violence, we have to say that reproductive violence perpetrated by Russians in Ukraine is multidimensional. As I have already mentioned, it can be either after committing war crimes with the intention of harming a person's reproductive health, or creating conditions under which health deteriorates to such an extent that it has serious consequences for reproductive function as well. And for example, in November 2023, a suspicion was notified in absentia procedure, of course, to a 42-year-old Russian serviceman during March and May 2022, while in the occupied territory of Kherson region, Ukraine, by prior agreement with other Russian servicemen in an organized torture chamber during the occupation of Kherson, detained and tortured the local population, who were beaten and tortured, deprived of food and water, and subjected to sexual violence in the form of electric shocks to their genitals. And after the torture, the man's reproductive health significantly deteriorated, and a forensic medical examination was conducted, which indicates that such deterioration is a consequence of torture by electric shocks. And currently this case is pending in court. In order to collect the evidence base, we need to evaluate the pool of evidence. It could be testimony of witnesses and statements of those who suffered from these crimes, conclusion of psychological examination, conclusions of forensic medical examination, which in this case we conduct not in order to prove the fact of physical injuries or sexual assault, but to establish the consequence for the body and organism. And the biggest obstacle in detecting and documenting these crimes is the very effective commission of such crimes in the territory, not under the control of the Ukrainian government, in the occupied territories, in places of deprivation of liberty, so-called the torture chambers. These crimes can be detected and documented only after the deoccupation of the territory by working directly with the civilian population. Thus, several years may pass from the moment of the crime to the moment of the occupation of the territory, and this makes the process of information gathering and documentation very difficult. Another challenge is the very fact of reluctance to report by a person who suffered as a result of such a crime. There are several factors of such reluctance. The person doesn't feel safe, is not in a protected environment, for example, lives in a territory that, although they occupied, is close to the line of combat clashes. Stigmatization and condemnation by society. For example, if a man has suffered sexualized torture, he may not want to report the crime in order not to question his masculinity, which is quite traditional in a patriarchal society. A person's fear of testifying officially before law enforcement agencies, a fears of being re-traumatization due to improper handling of the injured person. And I have also to point out that last September, Prosecutor General Andrei Kostin met with the UN Special Rapporteur on torture, Dr. Alice Jill Edwards, and reported that Russia has built a sophisticated system of torture and ill treatment of Ukrainians used against both prisoners of war and civilian population. He emphasized that the majority of Ukrainian prisoners of war were subjected to torture, rape, threats of sexual violence, and other forms of ill treatment. In the end of March this year, the UN Human Rights Monitoring Mission in Ukraine published a periodic report on the human rights situation in Ukraine for the period from December 1st, 2023 to February 29, 2024. And according to the findings of this report, torture and ill treatment of Ukrainian POWs in Russian internment facilities is widespread and routine. Prisoners of war are held in conditions that do not meet the requirements of international humanitarian law. Last week, the Commission of Inquiry presented its new report at the 57th session of the Human Rights Council, and stressed that the Commission has identified additional common elements in the use of torture by Russian authorities, reinforcing the findings that it was systematic. A further common feature is the recurrent use of sexual violence as a form of torture in almost all these detention centers. A stark fact that stands out in this report is more than the half of Ukrainian POWs interviewed by the mission for the purposes for the report stated that during their internment they were subjected to different forms of torture, including sexual torture. Now we work with Ukrainians released from Russian captivity. We see the deplorable consequences of such detention. Most of the women POWs stopped menstruating during their captivity. Many have told us about gynecological problems that now force women to undergo special hormone therapy, and in some cases even require surgery. There are some cases when survivors of sexual violence tell us that the Russians tortured them by deliberately hitting their genitals, while saying that they were doing it so that Ukrainians would not give birth to new Ukrainians. I also believe that the fact of Russia is shelling Ukrainian hospitals, children clinics, and maternity hospitals shows that the Russians intend to cause as much damage as possible to the Ukrainian nationals' reproductive health. You all must have remembered how Russia bombarded the maternity hospital in Mariupol in March 2022. Then, only according to confirmed data, a pregnant woman and her unborn child died. On 23 November 2023, Russian troops shelled the small town in Zaporizhia region with their missiles, and the maternity ward in the local hospital was hit. A newborn baby died. On the morning of Friday, 29 December 2023, a maternity hospital was hit during a massive strike on Dnipro, which is one of the biggest and largest cities in Ukraine. Part of the building was completely destroyed. Fortunately, people managed to move to the shelter. During a massive missile attack on the afternoon of 8 July this year, Russians hit Ahmadit, Ukraine's largest children's hospital. At the time of the attack, the children were in the basement, but There were interests. More than 2 hours later, fragments of Russian missile also hit a maternity hospital, also in one of the districts in Kyiv. This list, unfortunately, will be added because the war in Ukraine continues. And I don't want to end with that, but I want to stress that every public discussion, every bold statement bring us closer to the moment when CRSV and all of type of reproductive violence and CRSV violence will gradually cease to be a stigma for those who suffered it, and instead become a black mark on the reputation of those who organized, committed, and tolerated it. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Anna, for those additional examples, as well as all the challenges that you faced. And with this, I'm closing the panel segment for this event. I would like to move to give the floor to the audience here. And I would like to start by giving the opportunity to our co-sponsors of this event to take the floor on the first place. So I believe the Permanent Mission of Colombia wanted to speak next. Over to you.
Thank you very much. First of all, we would really like to thank you for holding this panel. The experience that we have had in Colombia in documenting reproductive violence has been very challenging, to say the least. And we believe that one of the main risks or situations that we face here is the high visibility of sexual and gender-based violence that in some cases rents other aspects of, in this case, reproductive violence to a second degree. One of the challenges that we have understood or noticed is, for example, the lack of data on reproductive violence. And this comes on two aspects: the lack of capacity building and knowledge from those recollecting data, but also the lack of understanding from the victims themselves. When we started documenting the processes at the Special Jurisdiction for Peace, both the Truth Commission and the Special Jurisdiction for Peace were able to identify four types of reproductive violence, which were forced contraception, forced abortion, forced birth, and forced motherhood. Particularly in terms of forced contraception and the last two, forced birth and forced motherhood, there's a cultural blockage in terms when you speak about forced motherhood, especially because you don't want to tell a mother that she didn't want to be a mother and she was forced to be a mother, or that she didn't want to give birth. Particularly in a society like Colombia, which is a very Catholic society, speaking of these issues is very difficult. But when we were talking about forced contraception, we also realized that the women did not understand that this was violence against them. Being forced, because it wasn't sterilization. You think about forced contraception and you think about sterilization, but just being forced to take a pill or have an ITU. So when we spoke, for example, to members of the guerrilla that were part of the armed groups, and they had been taking contraceptives since they were drafted when they were 14, 15, or 16 years old, they didn't understand that this was violence against them. So this leads to a backlog or a gap in the data that you can recollect. And then the other huge aspect is the difficulty or impossibility of linking long-term effects of reproduction to violence. So we've had cases of women that have been victims of rape that 5, 10, 15 years down the line have menstrual bleeding and have very large amounts of menstrual bleeding, and they go to the doctor, they go to even health institutions, and they're always told this has nothing to do with the rape that you suffered. But the reproductive system is one, and the trauma suffered by a victim of rape in a way could be, I'm not saying it is, but it could be linked to the effects that she shows 10 or 15 years down the line, but we still don't have enough data, enough information, medical information to be able to link this. And the same thing has happened to us when we've been trying to document abortions, unwanted abortions and malformation of fetuses in areas where there was aerosol spraying of the coca leaf. And so trying to get technicians and expertise on the ground to be able to do evaluations on the reproductive system of, or the reproductive impacts of things, for example, like the aerosol spraying of the coca leaves in rural areas has been close to impossible. So here is where the efforts of the international community, the mechanisms on the ground that can help document this and bring expertise to the ground and bring knowledge to those on the ground documenting this type of situations can be very useful. And lastly is also the participation of CSO and organizations working directly with victims, because of a lot of you have already spoken about not only the risks for their lives, but also the shame that speaking about this elements brings. And so the process at the Truth Commission and at the Special Jurisdiction for Peace for us have shown the importance of having a very comprehensive and holistic approach where everybody understands that when a woman, for example, says, what happened, there's something there, but it needs to be approached in a very delicate manner. And even she or the person in this case, we also documented LGBTQI hate-based crimes, needs to be approached from the ground up mainly. And so we think that this is a very important topic. We thank you for bringing it to the ground and to the work of the UN mechanisms. And hopefully we can keep increasing the data and the knowledge that we have here. Thank you.
I invite you to read the publication because Colombia comes a few times as a good example for other contexts to draw from. So the invitation is that I now have
Thank you very much. I want to warmly thank UN Women and the other esteemed panelists for bringing this very important and overlooked types of violations. As been detailed today, during conflict, women and girls are targets for reproductive violence, including forced pregnancy, forced sterilization, and forced marriage. And that's why we have been committed as the UK to ending impunity in many of these conflicts, and are, for example, working with partners, several in the room here, finding mission for Sudan, with the independent investigative body, reporting religious violations and abuses suffered by and this continuing that
legal framework around atrocity crimes and tackle these horrific forms of conflict-related sexual violence. And lastly, we wish to reiterate that we are proud to defend and promote universal and comprehensive sexual reproductive health rights. Too often we see reproductive health system treating women as objects rather than subjects. When they are faced with substandard sexual and reproductive health care services or denial of services, or on the very extreme and reproductive violations such as forced sterilization, which is one of the most extreme forms of control over a person's reproductive autonomy. And we look forward to continuing to work on this very important subject with UN Women and other partners. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And now I would like to give the opportunity to Canada to intervene. If they're here.
Thank you so much to UN Women and the Global Justice Center for organizing this side event, as well as to all the co-sponsors and panelists. Canada is pleased to have been supporting UN Women, JRR, and OHCHR in deploying experts specializing in gender and sexual and gender-based violence to relevant HRC investigative mechanisms to ensure that we are adopting gender-responsive and intersectional approaches to ensure that no one is left behind. Canada's position is that it is no longer acceptable for investigations to ignore sexual and gender-based violence, including violations and abuses of sexual and reproductive health, which impact women, girls, men, boys, and individuals of diverse sexual and gender identities, and that it's important we continue to mainstream the interrogation of these crimes in international accountability efforts. We've heard, I think, from 4 mechanisms today who have provided harrowing testimony of violations of sexual reproductive health. They have documented it in various contexts. You've touched on stigma, ensuring gender is referenced in the mandates. Carolina also mentioned lack of understanding of violations relating to sexual reproductive health in Colombia. But I was wondering if you could also perhaps expand on why certain mechanisms have been more successful than others in documenting these particular types of violations, and what are some of the challenges that we can help to address here at the HRC, and also how a lack of accountability and justice for reproductive crimes impacts transitional justice efforts and peace building. Thank you.
Thank you very much. So we don't have that much time. I would still like to give the opportunity to colleagues in the room to speak. I actually can recognize a few investigators, gender advisors, people working on the mechanisms. And I know some of them have worked on reproductive violence. So if some of the colleagues wish to share some additional examples of reproductive violence you've encountered in your work, I would like to offer that a space first, and then I'll take a couple of questions. Yes. So we have the colleagues from the Myanmar mechanism. Over to you, Julie and Kaya.
Thank you, Elena, for putting us on the spot. So here at the IIMM, we have clear reproductive harm in lines of inquiry. I'll give a few examples from our detention work. So after the military coup of February 2021, all perceived opponents to the military junta are arrested, detained, interrogated, and sent to prison. During that chronology of events, they suffer many crimes, including reproductive harm. For example, women have told us they were 5 months pregnant when they were arrested. They were beaten in the abdomen. They were later taken to a black site where they were held as sexual slaves for numerous months. They were repeatedly gang raped. The child survived, by the way, for this particular case. Women have told us that in prisons, they don't have access to menstrual hygiene, resulting in an array of infections impacting their reproductive capacity. Men have told us that they experience sexualized forms of torture, and as a result have erectile problems, also incapacitating them in the reproductive sense. I could go on with miscarriages of women as a result of bad food, bad health, no pre or postnatal care in Myanmar detention facilities, and so forth and so forth. But I would also like to give the floor to my colleague Gaia, who works on the Rohingya investigation.
Thank you. Yeah, just to integrate a little bit with some additional examples. In the case of the Rohingya, the evidence of reproductive violence is not difficult to find, and there are examples both of reproductive violence in connection directly with the sexual-based crimes, and also those that are not related. In the first category, we can list, of course, pregnancies, but interestingly, we have had also an expert explaining to us the connection between unwanted pregnancies and not just rape, but gang rapes, and how the presence of multiple perpetrators plays a role in the risk of pregnancies. Of course, children born as a result of the rape, sometimes kept, sometimes given in adoption, and in the worst case, abandoned, unsafe or incomplete abortion, sometimes leading to death, women resorting to home remedies, branches of tree, literally, just to provoke themselves an abortion. And this is also because services were not available in the first place. Damages to organs, targeting of pregnant women. In some cases, women who were 8-7 months pregnant lost their babies due to the violence, but also some were raped and before killed had their wound open, so they were additionally tortured before dying. So these are some of the sexual-based crimes connected to reproductive violence, but in the case of the Rohingya, we also see acts that are not connected at all to sex acts. For instance, the number one, measures aimed at preventing birth in a group. There were some legal provision aimed at limiting not only the ability of the Rohingya to get married, coupled also with practical and logistical challenging in accessing the services, but also limiting the amount of children that Rohingya could have, and also with very stringent controls and measures where these measures were contravened. And of course also the impact of all crimes on the reproductive capacity of the group, based also on the living conditions that are imposed on the group. And this is something that not necessarily pops out itself from the evidence, but it's up to us practitioners to be able to collect it and analyze it and spot it. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Julie and Gaia. Sorry to put you on the spot, but those were really very good examples. I think, unfortunately, we need to wrap up and we will need to vacate the room. And I still want to give the occasion to the panel and, of course, to the ambassador to provide some concluding remarks. But I just wanted to say that most panelists have said, if you have questions, if anyone wants to continue the conversation, please let us know. You can approach me now in the corridor, and we will also link you with the panelists if you wish to continue the conversations. So I'm just looking at the panel first. Does anyone want to give some final remarks before we hand over to the ambassador? Yes, Tess, please, over to you.
Yes, thank you so much. I'll be brief. I just wanted to thank my fellow panelists for sharing these examples and underscore how they highlight the importance of documenting this form of violence with specificity, because all of these impacts that we have been hearing about tend to go under the radar if they aren't looked for specifically. I also wanted to highlight what Shivai had said about the power that this particular form of violence gives to perpetrators to shape, alter, rupture social ties. That is one of the many reasons that it is so important for all actors in the justice chain to understand the importance of documentation and to know how to use this documentation of reproductive violence. To address Canada's question, the impact of this form of violence in transitional justice can't be overstated because of the impact that it can have on the integrity of societies. And so in that vein, I did want to share a couple of notes about what the Global Justice Center, GJC, will be doing in the next few months and years to continue this work. We will be developing highly accessible information resources based on the current report that is available today. And we're going to be holding events that will broaden its reach, including at the Assembly of States Parties in The Hague in December. So we hope to see all of you there. We also will be producing a follow-up report in the coming years analyzing further forms of reproductive violence that we couldn't cover within this report. And we plan to partner with fact finders to apply this analysis to particular contexts, including potentially Myanmar, Democratic Republic of Congo, and other contexts. Finally, we want to develop an array of training resources specifically geared to UN investigative mechanisms and their staff to ensure that all mechanisms have the tools needed to document this devastating form of violence, and to ensure that everyone within that justice ecosystem understands how to access, how to collect, how to use the information on reproductive violence so that we can stop this form of violence. Thank you.
Thank you, Tess, and we really look forward to the future work you have planned. Anyone else? Otherwise, it's really my pleasure to give the floor to the distinguished ambassador of Denmark, Mr. Id Petersen. Mr. Ambassador, we let you conclude this event, and thank you once again for the support for this event. Thank you.
Thanks a lot, Lena. And thank you, first of all, to the panelists, to their colleagues doing the actual job in the field. And of course, a lot of thoughts out to all the victims after these very shocking statements, even though you have to say this is not the first time we hear about that, but it just underlines the necessity of documenting these criminal acts. I think a lot has been said. It's not really to conclude because this work is not stopping here. And as we also heard, a lot of good initiatives on the way. From Danish side, we definitely keep on engaging in this work as well, both here in Geneva and Council, but other places as well. Denmark is, as of 1st of January, taken on a seat. We have been elected to a seat on the Security Council for a two-year period. And this is, of course, one of the elements when we talk about, normally it's within the heading of women and peace. But these are some of the things that we need to put a focus on in that context as well. Speaking of context, I also think it's a bit sad, or it's very sad, but we also have to realize that these years, there is a tremendous pushback on this sexual and reproductive health and rights, in particular of women and girls, but of all persons. So it just underlines again the necessity to keep on focusing on and ensuring the documentation when trying to move things. And then just, as was said also, impunity is simply not acceptable. As long as we have impunity, we have people just thinking this is normal, this is how things are, and this is my plight to be subject to this, and that's just not okay. That's what we need to say. And then I think a last comment that the reporting mechanisms are so important in this work, but we also need to look on where do we need to link up also. Already has been mentioned, the civil society organizations are very important at the local level. In this case, in particular, women-led and women organizations. But I also think from experience in a previous capacity as part of the UN humanitarian response, we also need, from member state side at least, to make sure that, for instance, when there is the coordination and the immediate action for a humanitarian response in a situation of conflict, it's not, and I was working for UNFPA, I just have to say, it's not easy to have these kind of issues high on the agenda from the beginning. It's not considered to be, we will come to that later, but now we just need to so. But we need to have that focus from the beginning, also in other fora, in terms also to create the awareness, to create action, and of course also to support the reporting mechanism. So let me end there. Thanks again, and we're happy to be part of this. And this is work, ongoing work in progress. Hopefully in progress. We will definitely be here from the Danish side. Thanks a lot.
Thank you very much. Thank you.